So hello and welcome everyone to tonight's talk here at Exploratorium Berlin. It's the edition number 9 in our key concept series entitled Improvisation, the Art of Becoming. And I'm very glad to welcome for this occasion Raymond MacDonald. My name is Matthias Maschat. I'm hosting the discourse program here as well as our concert series. And in the frame of our discourse events, I was happy to welcome Raymond already once before. We had set up a mostly online conference in 2022 with the title Improvisation as a Space for Experience, where Raymond has been one of the speakers on the subject. And now there popped up a wonderful possibility to invite Raymond again, thanks to Assi Glöde and Anna Kalusa, but not only for a talk, but also for a workshop that had taken place this afternoon, and also for a concert with the Berlin Improvisers Orchestra past Thursday. And this perfectly leads me to present Raymond to you, who is a saxophone player, a teacher and an academic, and who can therefore be invited very well for a concert, a workshop, and a talk. So we are here finally at part 3 of this whole thing. As a musician, Raymond has worked with major figures like Marilyn Crispell, Evan Parker, Maggie Nichols, George Lewis, and Günther Baby Sommer from the world of free improvisation, but also with avant-garde pop icons like David Byrne and Jim O'Rourke. One of his long-going projects is the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, which he has been co-founding more than 20 years ago and which he is still leading today. And I saw that next week you are also playing. You have Fred Frith as a guest there. That's fantastic. As an academic and teacher, he's professor for music psychology and improvisation at the University of Edinburgh, after having worked at Glasgow Caledonian University. He has edited numerous books, wrote a huge number of articles, and had many presentations on conferences and elsewhere. He's editor of books like Musical Identities, Musical Communication, Music Health and Well-Being, Musical Imaginations, and forthcoming is yet another book he has been co-editing on the work of the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra called New Directions in Musical Collaborative Creativity, the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra and the Theatre of Home, which is probably a good example of how Raymond bridges theory and practice based on his dual expertise as an academic and as an active improvising musician. And before we start the conversation, we said, since Raymond also has a new solo saxophone CD out tomorrow,
yes.
that this is going to be the start for tonight. Raymond will present himself firstly as a solo saxophone player. That's really really great spontaneous addition to the talk tonight. So thanks, Raymond, for being here, first of all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And and thanks for giving me the chance to play, because the solo album that I'm releasing tomorrow is called Desire Lines, the Gathering of the MacDonalds, and it's based upon playing an old bagpipe piece. There's a tradition of bagpipe music in Scotland called pibroch, and I found a pibroch dedicated to the MacDonald clan, and the album involves me trying to play this pibroch. But it's not possible for the saxophone to play a pibroch, because, as you maybe know, the saxophone has a drone plus a melody on top of the drone. But I quite enjoy trying to play the piece in the same way that I enjoyed trying to find out about my family heritage. But we all have ambiguities and fractured lineages within our own families. So trying to play this pibroch made me sort of think about our own identity and the way in which our identities are all constructed in various different ways. So I'm going to begin. Thank you for giving me the chance, but I'll begin by playing The Gathering of the MacDonalds.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That was actually a pretty good way to say hello.
Thank you. Hi.
Maybe I should have let you play first so that you can recover a little bit.
No, it's okay.
It's fine.
It's okay.
Yeah, first of all, why have you chosen the subject of music psychology for your career? What has fascinated you so much that you wanted to work in this field professionally?
Well, that's a great opening question. I think to begin with, I came to music not as a child prodigy or as somebody that went to music lessons from a very early age and I really have no music qualifications, but I discovered music as a teenager, playing with my friends in a pop band and discovering pop music. And at that time, there wasn't really the option for me to study music formally. Music wasn't really an option for me at the school I was at. And so I saw playing music with my friends as my passion. And I started studying actually science at university, but I failed miserably at science. But psychology has this interesting position as being both a science subject and a humanities subject, and to some extent an artistic subject as well. So psychology was my way of, if you like, staying in formal education. And I found that I really enjoyed talking about people, and I really enjoyed the discipline of psychology, while at the same time really wanting to be a musician. But I found that I was able to combine my music and my psychology after I graduated. So I graduated, and then I was working as a saxophone player, and I started working in community music with a Javanese gamelan. And I got the idea of doing a PhD around psychology and music. And really, at that point, the two subjects sort of came together for me. So I was working as a musician, but I had studied psychology, and I combined the two areas by doing a PhD on gamelan music for people with learning difficulties. And I looked at the musical and the psychological processes around playing sort of music, community music, if you like, for people with learning difficulties. And at that point, my two sort of passions kind of came together. And to be honest, it was never really a strategy. I didn't have an ambition to be a music psychologist. At that time, I have to be honest and say, I found things that I enjoyed doing, and I kept doing them. So I really enjoyed doing a PhD on music and psychology, and I enjoyed teaching. And at that time, I was playing lots of gigs. I was busking in the street in Glasgow. I was working in community music, and I was just finding lots of different ways to develop as a musician, while at the same time studying for a PhD. And then when I finished my PhD, I worked as a musician for a little while longer, and didn't work in academia. I worked in community music, but over the years, the two areas just became more closely intertwined. And then I worked in the psychology departments, but specialising in music psychology. And eventually, I moved to Edinburgh University in the music department, but working as a psychologist in the music department.
So obviously, you have been an improviser already before you took that path. Back then, what would you say? Have you already discovered in improvisation aspects that interested you on a psychological level that you could then try to research professionally?
If we go back, then the short answer to that question is originally no. To begin with, I was interested in the beneficial effects of playing music. So really, music, health and well-being was what drew me into psychology. So I was looking at the communication developments that took place, and the musical developments and the psychological developments that took place while people were involved in playing music. I witnessed myself working in lots of different contexts that when we're playing music and the situation's right, it has a very powerful effect upon myself, upon the people that I was working with, and particularly in these community music contexts. So I was drawn towards looking at the relationship between musical participation and health and well-being. It was during this process that I realised that improvisation was fundamental. So when I was working with a Javanese gamelan and people with learning difficulties, I realised very quickly that the little conventional musical training I had wasn't beneficial here. I was having to find a new way of communicating, a new way of working with people, and that involved being very flexible, being very open to new ideas coming at you, and in a sense, improvising socially and improvising musically. So there was a kind of a slow realization that improvisation was perhaps the most important process that I was working with, while at the same time, in the context of my PhD, I was making what you might want to say conventional measures of communication and musical skills. But if you look at my early work, it doesn't really discuss the improvisational aspects of it. It was later on when I started being interested in musical identities and interviewing jazz musicians about their own work, and also exploring my own musicality in more detail as an improvising musician, that this idea of exploring improvisation as being one of the most important musical processes kind of came to me.
The title that we have chosen for tonight is Improvisation, the Art of Becoming. This already fits pretty well to what you have just said, I think. It is this book that you have been co-authoring together with Graeme Wilson, one of your colleagues and friends, and I think you made quite a lot of music together too. Graeme Wilson was also in the online symposium together with you. And yeah, in that book you have been describing a lot of your thoughts and research on improvisation, and you have also been summing up many of the results. Could you explain what led the both of you to this really beautiful description, I think, the improvisation as the art of becoming?
So I think, and the title in some respects also reflects my relationship with Graeme as well, because as you point out, Graeme is my co-author on the book, but he's also one of my oldest musical collaborators. I mean, a lot of these discoveries that I made while working in music education, music therapy, I made with Graeme. And so he's one of my oldest friends. And I think it's really important to say that, all my work, my musical work and my academic work, is a collaboration. And I think that's another reason for using this word, the art of becoming, because it emphasizes the de-individuation processes that I think are really important for us to engage with. So that when we talk about creativity, we're not talking about an individualistic internal process, but we're talking about a social process. So my creative work and my intellectual work on this book was a collaboration with Graeme, and these ideas came out of our discussions with each other, and also the participants in our studies who also helped us reach these sort of conclusions and insights. And I think that's a really important point to make, not just in terms of academic work, but I think in terms of musical work as well, because we often think of musicians or composers or conductors as great individuals, and that when they are conducting or composing or improvising, they are showing us their individualistic skills. But I think it's really important to celebrate the social and the points at which one person's individuality merges with another person's individuality and becomes blended. And so the book is called The Art of the Becoming, to emphasize that process, that really, when we're improvising, we're engaged in a process and we're trying to be alert to the priorities of the moment, and we are, if you like, socially merged together in whatever context that we're working in. And so it's it's a play in the sense that the art of the becoming, in that improvisation is a process that is constantly developing and constantly evolving, and that to be engaged sincerely in that process is what makes improvisation really special. And so the collaboration is about the merging of the individuals, and improvisation celebrates the moment and celebrates the process rather than a particular output. But also, I guess when we call it the art, what we're saying is that it's sophisticated and complex and nuanced, and something that we can really engage in and really attempt to understand. And that process of trying to understand it is also a very rewarding process as well.
I'm thinking of how George Lewis has termed it in the foreword to your book. He said the art of becoming is an achievement without attainment. So somehow you always achieve something, but you never really arrive at the end. So it's an endless process in that you are delving in a way.
Yes, and we were so delighted that George was happy to write the foreword for us, because he's he's one of the true great figures in this field, and an inspiration to anybody that's involved in both researching improvisation and also performing improvisation as well. And I think he put it very well, once again emphasizing the process-based aspects of what we're doing.
I brought a few books in which there are articles from you.
Wow.
Just to show you, so this is the Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisation Studies, edited by George Lewis together with Benjamin Peacock. Here you have an article written together with Graeme Wilson. There's another article written together with Graeme Wilson here in this Expanding the Space for Improvisation, Pedagogy in Music. And here also the individuation, not only one author, together with Una McLone, who has been here twice already on conferences too, in a book called Distributed Creativity, Collaboration and Improvisation in Contemporary Music. So distributed creativity is maybe the word that fits to what you have just said before, to this de-individuation process. Could you, since we are here, maybe say a little bit more about this notion of distribution of creativity. And
it's great. It's really nice, in that few sentences there, you mentioned George Lewis, Graeme Wilson, and Una McLone as well, who's somebody else who's a very good friend, somebody else who I've collaborated with musically, but also somebody else that I've written with too. And so this idea of distributed creativity, I think, emphasizes the way in which, whether we are composing or performing, that the creative act is distributed socially. And so it's to give credit, if you like, to the social context in which all creative acts take place. And I guess the social construction of what we might want to call quality. So I think when we're involved in playing improvised music, we're also invited to engage with different approaches to aesthetics. You know, what is beautiful, what counts as beautiful, what is valued. And when we're working in a distributed sort of context, we can celebrate the social, and we can celebrate lots of different versions of what might count as beautiful and what might count as worthy, and in some way challenge what we might want to call hegemonic notions of individuality that sees creative works. I'm repeating myself a little bit here, creative works coming from within any one individual, but rather creative works coming out of groups of individuals who are performing, particularly in jazz music. I think if you look at jazz music, the history of jazz music tends to be the history of great men and those individuals who are all, iconic, fabulous players, but often the social context and the groups in which they worked and the relationships that they had, the creative relationships that they had, become secondary to venerating the individual achievements of any one person. Because also I think it creates a simpler narrative as well. If you say this one person is a genius and these other people over here are not geniuses, then it makes it a more simple narrative. I think it suits, once again, capitalist objectives as well, because in a sense you can say this person is valued, so his work, and I say his because very often if you look at the history, it is males, their work is valued and therefore can be commodified. It's much harder to commodify something that's nebulous and say, well, this is a group of individuals, and we're not actually going to pinpoint where the genius lies, because the genius lies across a group of people. Brian Eno also uses this phrase called scenius. In a sense, he says that individuals who rise out of any one particular scene and become the sort of focus of attention, rather than being geniuses, they're sceniuses, because they're able to gather together the keeper, or they become the. And I think Brian Neal's, he says that himself. He's a good example of someone that becomes the focus for a whole lot of social creativity.
Yeah, that's also the idea of the cultural capital.
Yes.
By Pierre Bourdieu. It also goes into that direction. Your research and also your fascination, it's all about the potential of improvisation. This is what I find also in the idea of the art of becoming. This points at the possibilities that you can unfold as an individual, or even at the potential for development as a human being as such. It can uncover treasures in education and contribute to a person's health and well-being, as you have said before. And at the same time, we arrive at the point where we can say, and I'm citing you and Graeme again here, improvisation is life and life is improvisation. So maybe, first of all, maybe let us continue here. When you say improvisation is a fundamental aspect of life, can you explain how this is meant and give a few examples maybe?
Sure. So I think rather than view improvisation as purely a musical process, if we say that as we move through life, we are faced with a series of improvisational choices on a daily basis. So whether that is, you're walking down the street and you meet somebody, you have a conversation, you decide how long you're going to speak to them for, you decide or you negotiate, how long you might speak to them, you negotiate the topics that you might speak to them about, and then you move on with your daily business. But these are essentially improvisational decisions that we make. How long do I speak? When do I change the conversation? When am I going to develop the conversation? When do I agree? And so I think when we're improvising musically, we're also engaged in those types of improvisatory decisions. So when we're improvising musically, we're deploying some of the social skills that we have, some of the social knowledge that we have, and the social repertoires of interaction that we use in an improvisatory and in a music context. And I think when you think about it in that sense, it opens up a whole range of possible aesthetic type of work, but a whole range of communicative possibilities as well. And I think that also ties into this idea of improvisation as being fundamental in health and well-being. And at this point, I'd also like to acknowledge the influence that music therapists have had on my work as well, because music therapists' work is predicated on a very sensitive and highly nuanced understanding of the musical communication process. And within that musical communication process, improvisation is one of the most important musical processes that music therapists use to help build up a clinical relationship or to help build up a therapeutic relationship with somebody who may have problems communicating verbally. So somebody who has problems communicating verbally because whether they're depressed or they have a mental illness, they may be able to express themselves musically in the context of a therapeutic relationship with a music therapist through improvisation. They may be able to express deep and profound feelings and emotions that they have trouble verbalizing. And so here, improvisation plays a really important role in sustaining, enhancing somebody's health and sustaining and enhancing a relationship with a music therapist. But my argument here is that the basic musical and social processes involved in that improvisatory relationship between a clinician and a client can be very similar to improvising in a performance context, improvising in a large ensemble, improvising in community music contexts or in school contexts. So here we come to understand improvisation as being a social, a creative, a musical, an artistic process that has commonalities across a range of different domains. And so pulling together work from music therapists, or pulling together work from educational psychologists, or pulling together work from musicologists, and seeing improvisation in its broadest sense, I think is really important. So that, for example, that earliest communication between a parent and a child, the bonding that takes place in those early weeks and months between a newborn baby and its primary caregiver, is essentially an improvisation and is essentially musical and creative. So music plays an absolutely fundamental role in the earliest and most important bonding relationship of our lives. The patterns of interactions laid down in those early weeks and months will influence us across the rest of our life. I mean, there's no question of that. Yet these patterns of interactions are essentially musical and improvisatory. So we are all improvisers. We are all musical. And I think that also is a very interesting backdrop against when people discuss their own musicality. They might say, oh, I'm not musical, or my family aren't musical. Yet musical interaction and improvisatory interaction is unequivocally universal.
Do you see a gap or a border between improvisation in art or improvisation in life, or does it really melt together completely for you?
So yes and yes. So I think first of all, it absolutely melts together. I mean, and I feel, what's the word? Very privileged that I'm able to engage in artistic projects where the blurring of the social and the artistic is celebrated. And once again, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Maggie Nichols, who's an absolute icon, a feminist icon, and a world-leading figure in improvisation, but also an evangelist for celebrating the improvisatory fundamentals of life and the way in which life and art are really completely merged. If you work with Maggie and you're rehearsing with Maggie or performing with Maggie, she'll very often want to continue the performance over lunch, and the concert finishes, but Maggie's still improvising when you go to the bar and have a conversation with her. She just has this sort of beautiful holistic approach to improvising. So in that context, I'm 100% with Maggie in terms of her blurring of the boundaries between the performative and the social. But of course, context is everything as well. And so, here we are, the lights are on, you pick up your saxophone, there's a microphone, there is no question that also is a slightly different type of improvisation as well. And so it is possible that things can be two things at once. On the one hand, if you're on a stage with an audience playing a piece of music, it has a different role and a different function to a social improvisation. But what I'm saying is, if you take a different lens and you just tweak it slightly, it becomes very similar. You say, well, actually, I'm making choices. I'm thinking about communicating ideas. I'm trying to reach and connect with other people, whether it's my fellow musicians or other people in the audience. I'm trying to do this in a way that's very similar to trying to negotiate daily life as well. So that's a very long way of agreeing with both your suggestions.
No, but it's a perfect answer because, as you said, it's about the context that defines the situation in the end. Yes. And still you find a lot of commonalities, and still you have also the aim of maybe leaving the borders behind, stepping across the borders.
The borders, yes.
When you've been talking now about health and well-being, you've mostly been referring right now to work with people who are maybe in a therapy. But beyond this, what are the research results for the importance or the meaning of improvisation for people in their lives? What does it do to them, the fact that they are improvising?
Sure. I mean, maybe I could talk a little bit there about the most recent book that's actually came out yesterday, I believe. So in this context, when COVID came and we all had to stay in our homes, the work of the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, like all music ensembles around the world, stopped or radically changed. And so we decided to try and meet online. Like many people, we tried to take our work online. However, we thought that we had very low expectations. We thought, well, instead of meeting in a room, not unlike this, 20 of us, 25 of us, we'll meet online and it'll be a social event. Because nobody knew what was unfolding at that time. So we thought, well, this is a social event. We can have a cup of tea, we can have a chat, and we'll try and play some music over Zoom. And like many people who try to play music over Zoom, we realized, well, we can't do it the same way. We can't, it's got to be different. But because we were using improvisation as our primary mode of musical communication, the common problem that people mentioned when they played on Zoom, for example, the time lag, wasn't a problem for us. The dodgy quality that people would complain about when you tried to play on Zoom didn't necessarily become a problem for us because we let these features become emergent aspects of the improvisation. So everybody in their room heard something slightly different, but we were all actually getting quite excited at the possibilities of merging the visual with the sonic, because we were all looking on a screen in a completely different way from how we might have done if we were playing in a room. And so improvisation became a way by which we could sustain our community. We could meet, what we thought we'd do was once a week, but we started meeting twice a week online, and we developed new ways of interacting, new ways of being sort of musical, of being artistic together. And also, because we were online, we could start to invite people from around the world to join our online sessions. And as the book points out at the start, we had over 150 people over the course of the first 18 months of the pandemic who came in and joined our sessions. And so we developed new ways of working artistically, but this is the key point to your question. We carried out a number of interviews with people about their experiences, and what we found was that not only were we sustaining and enhancing community, but people were feeling better about themselves because they could have some social contact and some artistic contact. So the improvisation facilitated these online sessions, but not only did they facilitate the online sessions, as a result of the online sessions, people's mental health was sort of enhanced. And so improvisation became a way of providing health and well-being benefits. And to go back to your question, not in a clinical sense. It wasn't like the sessions were never set up to help people clinically. And although music therapists came and took part in our session, there was one of our sessions, Hope Young in Austin, Texas, came along regularly to our sessions, but she wasn't participating as a therapist. If you like, the health and well-being developments were secondary to the primary aim of really just getting together, because we were all in our houses, isolated, and we were able to get together on Zoom. But improvisation provided the process by which we could connect, and improvisation provided the process by which we could overcome some of the common technical hurdles that people talked about. And not only that, but we were able to really develop new ways. Lots of people were using virtual backgrounds and using art and using text in new and creative ways, and getting quite excited about it as well. So in that sense, that's where improvisation, out with a clinical context, can have positive effects on health and well-being as well. And I think if we look at the work of community musicians too, because community musicians might not necessarily be concerned with health and well-being developments, but community musicians might be interested in bringing people into musical situations who have been denied the opportunity of getting access to music through issues of poverty or issues of health or issues of geography. So community musicians might run improvisation sessions in a community centre or a church hall, and here also the improvisation offers opportunities for collaboration. It offers opportunities to create new music, opportunities to help with people to develop their confidence in performing together. But as a result of this, there can often be secondary health and well-being benefits that go hand in hand with these artistic developments.
So also this can be considered as a potential of improvisation, that it can be used in kind of educational environments, not only for kids but also for adults. This is what is an important part of improvisation's exploratorium's idea here too, to kind of tear down the borders for everyone to have the potential for creative expressivity, creative expression.
Absolutely. I mean, and I wholeheartedly agree with that ethos, that we often think of improvisation as something that elite musicians do once they've learned to play their instrument. Mm-hmm. But it's clear that the improvisation can be right at the heart of musical education and music experience right from the start, so that whether it's in formal educational context or informal educational context or just informal music making, if we celebrate improvisation and include improvisation as part of somebody's musical journey, whether that be for children or for adults, then I think that enhances the whole creative experience for somebody as well, rather than saying, when you learn an instrument, you first have to learn where to put your fingers, you first have to learn how to play your chords, how to play your scales, how to play particular phrases, and practice these things very dedicatedly. What you can say is, as well as doing that, we can also improvise. What sort of sounds does the piano make when you put your hands on these keys? What sort of sounds can your voice make? What sort of sounds can you make that you might enjoy? Do you like the sound of those three notes played together? How can you play those 3 or 4 notes and connect with somebody else who's playing a guitar or singing a song? So this type of learning, this type of experience can be right at the heart of everybody's musical learning. And I think in that sense, improvisation becomes a way of challenging conventional notions of what virtuosity is. So I think for a long time, we have defined musical virtuosity on quite narrow terms. So if you think of a virtuosic musician, we tend to think of somebody who plays very fast, very fluently, has lightning reflexes, somebody who can read music really, really well. But musical virtuosity can include other types of virtuosity as well: virtuosic listening, virtuosic collaboration, to use Maggie Nichols' phrase, social virtuosity as well. And I think it's important within music education to try and include these other types of virtuosities, so that we can be more inclusive about what counts as musical, what counts as good music, and also to get more people involved in playing music. So I think this sense of broadening out what is virtuosic to include new types of virtuosity, and I think this ties in with, I think improvisation has a really important role to play in that, and it also has a really important role in what we might think of developing healthy musical identities, not just for children, but for everybody who's involved in playing music.
Yeah, you are giving me the next keyword.
Right.
Are you reading along my notes? Yeah, I mean, identity is one of your main research interests, and I also find this extremely interesting. This research that you are doing into this direction. You have edited the Handbook of Musical Identities, for example. So you have published on this extensively, and you are putting great emphasis on musical identity. I think this has also been a subject of the workshop a little bit today. So why is that, and what does this mean to you in the context of improvisation?
So I think identity is, well, it almost sounds like a cliche right now to say identity is important, isn't it? Because when we edited the first book called Musical Identities in 2002, we made the case that identity was an important issue within contemporary times, because our roles within society were much less fixed in terms of our gender roles, in terms of the expectations of work. But there's been an explosion over the past 20 years, and it's now identity is front and centre in so many discussions about who we are and how we want to live our lives, and the choices that we make. And in the book, we make the case that not only is identity a fundamental issue for contemporary life, but music is a universal medium through which we express our identity and we create our identity. You know, music is absolutely inextricably linked into all sorts of aspects of our social, cultural, and personal lives. And so we use music to signal to the world who we are. You know, our musical tastes, particularly for young people, musical tastes are really important. If you ask a young person to define themselves or talk about themselves, they might tell you where they live, who their friends are, but they'll use music as a badge of identity. They'll use music as a way of saying, this is who I am, and music will influence their friendship groups, it'll influence the websites that they visit, it'll influence the clothes they wear and what they do in their social time. So, identity is an absolutely crucial part of people's lives, and music is a crucial part of people's lives as well. And when we think of improvisation as well, so for musicians who are involved in improvising, it becomes an important part of their identity. So for jazz musicians are expected to be a particular type of improviser, and so their sense of who they are as a musician is linked to their sense of how they improvise and what they improvise, and also for experimental musicians who engage in exploring the relationship between improvisation and composition. Improvisation becomes an important part of their identity as well. And I guess working with trying to broaden people's experiences of music, people who think or who might be a little bit nervous about improvising, that's I would see that as an identity question. Say, well, actually, if you try improvising in this way, or you can still improvise without necessarily having all this particular type of knowledge. There's different types of knowledge that you can have that will allow you to engage with improvising. So the relationship between improvisational practice and identity is a really important one as well. And I guess looking at that as a psychologist as well as a musician, you can bring these these disparate areas together. You can say, well, here's some ideas around how people view themselves and see themselves, and here are some musical constructs about how we might interact, and say, well, we can take these musical techniques and we can combine these musical techniques with certain psychological constructs and explore the relationship between improvisation and identity. Don't know, am I rambling a bit?
We're in a wonderful talk, actually, and that's all very interesting answers. And I still have more questions.
Keep them coming. Keep them coming.
So when I think of identity in improvisation, I mean, obviously, I would say that in all art, all creative processes, maybe we can say that the result or what you do is connected somehow to your identity, maybe in a way. And especially in improvised music, we often hear that the musicians are playing themselves. We hear that they have developed their own language. We have, of course, been talking about distributed creativity, de-individuation, and there's also group identity, I guess. But still, talking about this maybe a little bit older idea of the individual musician developing his or her own identity. How would you argue about this?
Oh yeah, I think that's.
And I would say this is really also a potential of improvising, or I mean, as a composer, it's probably the same thing.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and it makes perfect sense, and it in no way contradicts the notion of de-individuation and distributed creativity. But yes, I mean, we've mentioned some of the figures. We can look at Maggie Nichols' approach to vocal improvising as well. She has created her own approach and her own identity in improvising, and so she has her own sound, and she's instantly recognisable as Maggie Nichols. But anybody that knows Maggie's work knows that she also celebrates community and that sense of everybody being involved in that process together. So I think you can still have an individual voice, but be part of a very important social dynamic. Also thinking about other Evan Parker, I suppose, arguably one of the most important post-John Coltrane saxophonists, has developed a uniquely individual sound on the saxophone as well. So his sonic identity and his musical identity is unique. But once again, he's part of a wider community of musicians, particularly that developed in the London, along with Maggie in the late 60s and over the course of the 70s and the 80s. So his unique and individual voice developed as part of a community of musicians. And of course, and Berlin was one of the key sort of meeting points. You know, Peter Brotzmann and the Globe Unity Orchestra and Günter Baby Sommer and these musicians as well, that one could argue, thinking of identity, created a unique and indelible mark on the history of jazz. Because if we think of what is the European contribution to the history of jazz music, one might say it's that generation of musicians who individually and collectively created an identity that was utterly unique and also located in geography as well. So the identity of their sound was also attached to these centres of improvisation, be it Berlin, be it London, be it Amsterdam as well. So I think, you know, we can expand this argument to talk about not just individual identity, but the relationship that this individual identity has within the history of jazz music.
Yeah, definitely. So you can relate, as you said, to individuals and also to collectives.
Yes.
You can do this to places and certain aesthetics and so on that are developing in that course.
So I think it is important to say that this notion of collectivity, this notion of distributed creativity, doesn't necessarily stand in opposition to any. I'm not trying to argue against the skills of the individual, but what I am suggesting is that we've acknowledged the skills of the individual for hundreds of years, but what we haven't done is acknowledge the skills of the group, and we haven't acknowledged the importance, or I would say, of de-individuation. And indeed, one might say that one of the big challenges that society faces politically, ecologically, socially, is to de-individuate to some extent, to think of ourselves less as individuals and more as part of social collectives. And I think, as we demonstrated today, hopefully when we had this wonderful session upstairs today, and one of the points that I was making was that when you're improvising in a group, and the group is negotiating time and aesthetics together without one person leading it, the sense of where I end and my fellow musician begins becomes ambiguous, because nobody's in charge, yet we're negotiating our way through this. So that's another aspect of de-individuation, that as a collective, our individual choices become merged. And I think that is one of the fundamental challenges we face as society, is that how do we communicate as a group? How do we communicate with each other? How do we communicate with nature? And to extend it, how do we communicate with technology and machines? And one of the important challenges, I think, is to de-individuate, to not see ourselves as being at the centre of our existence, to see us merged with each other, to see us merged with nature, and to see us merged with technology. And I think here, improvisation has a really important role to play, because it facilitates that very type of collaboration that emphasises de-individuation and collectivity, and the psychological, social and creative processes that are at the heart of improvisation, one might say, allows us to face some of the biggest challenges that we have globally.
So when we stay with this term identity, since we live in a time where there's a lot of stress on identity politics, and there's also at the same time a lot of critique being put on that, do you think that improvisation also holds this potential to rather focus on developing some own authentic identities rather than relating to some external group?
Yes, I think so. I think if I understand you correctly, I'm not suggesting that improvisation in and of itself is necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's the context in which we engage with improvising and the way in which we approach it. So, for example, we bring to every improvisatory context a set of relational responsibilities. So it's often discussed within improvisational context, are we free? Is this free improvisation? And I want to improvise because improvisation gives me personal freedom. But that personal freedom is unequivocally relational. And so, for example, if you are drawn to improvisation because you want to be free, but free from what? So a jazz musician may want to be free from the constraints of conventional harmony within bebop playing, or a classical musician may want to be free from the conductor's baton or from reading music. People also come to play free improvised music for social and personal reasons as well, because playing the music gives them a sense of freedom that they don't have in their life. But they bring to that context responsibilities of relating to other people in the room. And so, to go back to your point, we must hold these relational responsibilities very dear to our hearts when we're involved in playing. It's for me, I see it as a I'm so grateful and thankful, and that my life is privileged in this way that I'm able to step into these experiences. But I also appreciate that I don't take them for granted. They're fragile, and we can't just assume because there's 12 of us in a room and we're going to improvise together that it's going to be great. It needs everybody to commit to that environment and to trust and give each other respect and to celebrate ambiguity. And I think that's really important as well. And I would argue that these are the skills that we need outside of the music improvisation workshop as well. So the short answer to your question is yes. It's not magic. We don't just all of us step into a room and engage in improv, and it's all, we work at it, and we treasure it, and we respect the process and respect the freedoms that we have within that sort of relational context.
I tried to split the talk a little bit into two parts.
Mm-hmm.
So the first would be The Art of Becoming, the
Mm-hmm.
first title of the book, and how group improvisation works as the next part. And obviously we have been talking about quite a lot of issues already, about things that are crucial to how group improvisation works. And maybe first of all, you said in the book that there's a huge importance of understanding how musicians talk about their music, about their identities, their improvisation, and you've been leading qualitative studies, talking to musicians, also together with Graeme Wilson. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this research process and what to which results it led you.
Sure.
In regard to the question how group improvisation works, you came up with a model in the end. And
yes. So I think, once again, the academic work developed in much the same way as an improvisation might develop, in that we didn't go into this with an end point. We didn't go into this process saying we want to develop a model to explain how improvisation works. We entered into the process, and once again, as you get older, you think it was it's nearly 20 years. 20 years. I used to say a few years ago, but a few years ago is now.
Let's put it like that. It's a few years ago.
20 years. So we started. One was I had been working as what you might want to call a traditional experimental psychologist, setting up experimental groups and control groups and doing statistics and analysing the effects of music on pain perception, the effects of music on self-esteem and whatnot. But I became increasingly interested in qualitative research and in subjective positions and in phenomenology. And so when I started working with Graeme, we ran some focus groups with jazz musicians in Scotland to ask them about their life as a jazz musician. The goal here was that we didn't want to assume we knew what they were going to tell us. We wanted them to tell us what was it like being a jazz musician, to find out a little bit about their working practices and their musical practices. And what we found in those early workshops were a couple of things. One, we had difficulty. There were very few women that were involved, or at that time, that would see themselves as professional jazz musicians. The jazz musicians talked as much about their lifestyle as they did about the music. And so we came up with this code called Jazz Life Is, and the jazz musicians saw themselves as living a particular type of life that was different from classical musicians and different from popular musicians as well. And they also talked about elements within the music, about the swing feel that was at the heart of jazz music, but they also talked about the socio-musical context where jazz music involved, to quote one of our participants, somebody up front showing off their fancy finger work, so that it involved a sort of technical prowess. But as the work developed, we started interviewing jazz musicians and improvising musicians and comparing, getting more females involved in the sample. And then we started asking people to come in and improvise for us in a recording studio, and then listen to those improvisations and talk about those improvisations. So rather than having a sort of broad brush approach to saying, what is jazz music, what is jazz life, what are the challenges, we became much more interested in, if you like, the process of improvising and the process of playing, so the jazz music, but in particular improvising, and then gradually free improvising as well. And I guess this is the key point. So we started to find things like, so musicians talked about the importance of silence and the importance of ambiguity, in the sense that not all the musicians would define the same improvisatory moment in the same way. And so ambiguity was a really important part of the improvisatory process. But then we also started to realize that the musicians would point to certain moments in an improvisation and say, that's a moment of change. I can hear the music changing. And they'll say, oh, that's a moment of contrast. I can hear the drums contrasting what the guitarist is playing. And gradually, we saw patterns in their language. We saw patterns emerging whereby the decisions that the musicians were making were really important. And so that's where the model emerged from. We say, oh, again and again, the musicians would talk about, this is a point of change. This is a point of contrast. This is a point of I'm mirroring what somebody else is doing. And so we developed this kind of flowchart or model to suggest that this is how improvisation proceeds. And we then started testing that model, not only with musicians, but with dancers and with artists and with filmmakers. And we were lucky enough to spend a week at the Tate Modern Gallery in Liverpool, where we not only did we present our ideas, but we became an installation. We had one of the rooms in the gallery, and each day we would present improvisations, but we'd also present discussions. We would talk about the relationship between clinical improvisation and performance-based improvisation. We developed paintings and sculptures, all based around this particular model of improvising as well. And something else that we noticed when the is this okay? Is this yeah? Stop me if I...
This is what I was asking for. Okay. Yeah, go on. I think we still have a bit.
I was talking in the workshop today that often when I'm in these situations, I have my daughter's voice in my head, and it says, "Dad, stop talking," because my daughters were very direct with me when they were when they were teenagers. Right? Okay, you'll tell me to stop talking, because sometimes it's the only way I can actually stop talking is just to hear Eva and Maria in my head going, "Dad, stop talking." Okay. But anyway, I won't stop talking.
No, please go on. That's what you're here for.
So, the patterns of talk, as well as highlighting these types of improvisational choices that musicians make when they're engaged in improvising, they also highlighted different repertoires of talk. So, musicians, when they talk about improvising, may talk about a mastery of their instrument. So we say we outlined across the dozens of interviews this particular style where musicians would say, yes, you have to learn to play your instrument, you have to develop some technique. It's not magic, but techniques involved in improvising. So we called this a mastery repertoire. But alongside the mastery repertoire, we also saw lots of examples of what we called a mystery repertoire. And in the mystery repertoire, the musicians were emphasizing the more ineffable, the more soulful aspects of playing music. So you might say, when you're improvising, you're not aware of time going by. When you're improvising, you're connecting with other people in ways that we don't understand. So both these repertoires were particularly important for the musicians, a repertoire of mastery and a repertoire of mystery. And so we combined these different types of repertoires with the model that emphasizes that musicians make decisions and choices when they're improvising. And if you look at this as being the part of the fundamental processes of improvising, then you can see beyond the purely technical. You see, okay, so dancers and musicians can improvise in a similar way, because the dancers are making similar choices to the musicians about the decisions that they make that underlie their improvisational context. And actually then I would extend that to say not only dancers and musicians, but young babies when they're improvising with their parents, or when parents are improvising with their young babies, and professional jazz musicians and dancers. Perhaps the improvisational choices are similar in all these particular contexts, and that then celebrates the social foundations of improvising. And again, you know, these ideas emerged in my work with Graeme through the interviews, through the focus groups, and through the asking people to come in and improvise in the studio and reflect upon those improvisations. And we were also lucky enough to have a project called Concurrent, where we invited dancers, therapists, filmmakers, artists, and then also chefs and skateboarders and other people who were making improvisational choices as part of their daily life. And we set up these discussion sessions where people would talk about the sort of ways in which different people would improvise in important situations. So yeah, that's part of the sort of the research trajectory that I've had with Graeme.
I'm glad that we are talking about the decisions and the decision-making process. So this is actually a question which has always been accompanying me in a way, and that is the questions of how decisions are made. So if these decision-making processes are something that can be considered as being taken consciously, or is it something unconsciously? Or is it intentional or unintentional? So what is a decision for you from a psychological perspective? Yeah. I'm really glad that I have a music psychologist here who hopefully can lift that secret for me.
No, that's a great question, and it comes up a lot, and I'm really glad you asked it, because as I say, as a psychologist, I would hate for people to think that you have this model, and that people, when I'm not suggesting that people when they're improvising go, okay, now I have to change something. Okay, I will change something. Now I'm going to contrast. Oh, here is a contrast. Absolutely, we're not saying that. I'm not saying it's all unconscious, because we can, in the transcripts, we see people reflecting on their own improvising and recognizing that they have made a conscious decision to change what's happening. What I think happens is that as you become more experienced in improvising, you make these decisions much more quickly. Also, you can make them, they can be automated in the same way that when you practice the trumpet, what you're looking for is the automation of motor control. So you don't have to think so much about, I put my finger here and I get a C, and put my lips like that, get a C. It happens automatically, but you have to practice that motor activity in order for it to be automized. I think with improvising, the more you practice improvising, the more these decisions can be automized as well. So
this might be part of the virtuosity.
Yes, virtuosic decision. I mean, undoubtedly, that's part of the virtuosic decision-making process, so that the more experienced you get at improvising, the quicker you can make these decisions. And I'm not saying that the more confidence you have in them being the correct decisions, but the more confidence you have in making the decisions. And I think that's what's important. It's not making the right decision, it's making a decision and saying, this is a decision that I've made. So yes, that process moves from conscious awareness into sort of automation, unconscious awareness. But here's the other, I think, beautiful part of this. There's also a whole reservoir of unconscious processes coming to bear when we're improvising as well. Because when we're playing music, we're expressing, ideas, or hopes, or dreams, or fears. We're expressing what it means to be human. And of course, just as in any conversation that you have, there are unconscious factors at play in the decisions that lead you to say certain phrases, say certain words in any conversation. When we're improvising as well, there's unconscious processes that come to bear. And I think that's what makes improvisation so beautiful and so complex and so rich, that there are different layers of conscious and unconscious processes coming to bear when we're improvising. But just to emphasize, the model doesn't proceed in that linear way. We may be making 4 or 5 decisions all at the one time. And we may not have conscious awareness of those decisions. On the other hand, for example, today when we were upstairs, we had a number of improvisations where we were reflect how are we going to begin the improvisation. So one might think then, okay, the conscious decision to enter into an improvisation might be very clear. I'm going to start now with a long note. There's my long note. So that moment of entering into the improvisation is a very conscious decision. However, once you're into the improvisation, there can be a whole host of conscious. It could be, am I feeling confident today? Or and I think this is where improvisatory practice in these performance contexts merges with also an understanding of music therapy practice as well, and that your repressed feelings as well will have an influence in the choices that you make in any improvisatory context. And I think that's also why the improvisatory situation is really rich for looking at musical identities as well, because I'm not reading the notes on a page. It's not like I'm sitting down saying, well, in order to negotiate this piece of music appropriately, I have to read these notes as the composer intended. What we're saying is it's much more open, and it's much more about making these types of decisions.
To me, it always was a bit strange to talk about decisions, because for me, improvisation was always very much connected to the notion of flow. Again, talking to a music psychologist. So when you just let things happening, you just let things happen. The body is doing something. You are not really thinking about it, but you go into interaction with the environment. My experience is that things are rather happening. Of course, you go there prepared and you bring your knowledge and your material and your experience and everything. But it always struck me to talk about decisions in that moment, because decisions for me have always been more connected to something that I actually think about. And then there's different options. And then I say, okay, this is the best option, so I go for this. This, to me, I would say this is a decision. But obviously there's other ideas about this.
No, that's I think it's a great area to move into, because I think Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow involves that precise moment where you're not aware of time passing, you're not aware of making decisions, you're engaged in an activity that's challenging, but it's not too easy and it's not too difficult. It's challenging, but you feel you are up to the challenge, and it's then, when these different environmental factors come together, we can experience a state of flow. My argument would be that still involves decision making. It's just that we are not aware of making those decisions because we are in we're in that state of flow. Maybe like if you imagine cooking, you know, a meal, and you're really enjoying cooking the meal, and you've got a pot, you've got your milk, you've got your sugar, you've got your utensils, you're chopping up things. Things are just happening, you know, and you're maybe not making the conscious decision about when to chop the onions and when to add the milk and what the temperature is. It's just all happening, but you are still making decisions. It's just that you're able to integrate these decision-making moments into an overarching framework that celebrates the process at a macro level rather than in the moment-to-moment decision-making level. And some of my earlier work did work with musicians where we tried to inculcate a state of flow during compositional and performance activities. And then we looked at the way in which teachers who weren't aware of the aims of the experiment graded the participants' work for creativity and for quality. And what we found was that the more the students flowed, as defined by Csikszentmihalyi using his experience sampling questionnaire, the more they flowed, the more creative and higher quality the output was graded by the teachers. Slightly going tangential here, but to go back to your point, I absolutely understand why you would say when things are going really well, it's not a decision-making process. It's about being in the flow and just, you know, you're enjoying the moment, you're experiencing the moment. You feel that there is a energy and a momentum to the process that doesn't necessarily involve you going, I'm going to push this button, I'm going to make this sound. But my argument is that you're just in the zone so much that you're not aware of these decisions that are taking place, and that those decisions are still happening. In the same way that you might not be aware of unconscious processes that are being brought to bear on a conversation, whether that's a musical conversation or a verbal conversation. But my argument with those unconscious processes are unequivocally there. They're just not under the microscope at that particular point.
Do you think they might be these kind of unconscious developments and decisions, might they rather be to what has been connected to the notion of the ineffable then by the musicians, that they make this experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of my interpretations, that when they say ineffable, when the musicians say, you know, things are just progressing, what they're, for want of a better word, they're saying that they're in a state of flow. Now, whether flow is uniquely what Csikszentmihalyi categorized as flow, because he was quite particular about what he felt what was flow. I mean, increasingly, I prefer a more metaphorical definition of what flow is, and that sense of ineffable. Once again, you know, the workshop that we had upstairs, you know, there were moments today where, you know, I was experiencing what I called a gestalt, you know, so the sound in the room was holistic, and the group seemed to be moving like the one organism through the improvisatory moments. And I was, so, you know, to me that's a kind of metaphorical understanding of what flow is, rather than a sort of reductionist, well, it has these five elements. But to go back to your key point, I think when we're in those moments, there's a de-individuation that takes place. There is a sense of enjoyment in the process, and a lack of individual awareness of a moment-to-moment decision-making process. But those decisions are still being made.
Keith Sawyer has also been talking about the group flow.
Yes, yes. Another sort of master and a big influence on me and Graeme's early work. You know, he's got a really, and I also like the way in which Keith Sawyer draws on theatre improvisation as well, and his earlier work in Chicago, and uses that sort of those sorts of metaphors as a way of explaining musical improvisation as well.
let us also talk about this communication aspect in
Mhm.
improvisation. We've been talking about this already a little bit when
Mhm.
we've been talking about distributed creativity. There's a chapter in your book
Mhm.
called Distributed Creativity and the Myth of Shared Understanding.
Yes.
So how important is shared understanding? Does it actually happen? Is that
Mhm.
even possible?
Mhm.
And you also before you said that there might be something like it really goes well. There might be something like a successful improvisation, successful group play. If there is, would a kind of shared understanding be the precondition
Mhm.
for a successful improvisation, or is this
Mhm.
this not the right ingredient, the most important ingredient for this thing?
Mhm. So I think that's a really good point. I think shared understanding, of course, is possible, but there is what I would argue it's almost a cliche that when two musicians are improvising together, they're in some sort of mind meld situation where one musician absolutely understands what the other musician is doing, and they both have the same definition of quality, or they both have the same understanding of the moment to moment processes involved. Our work and other people's work have shown that very often the musicians won't have the same understanding of what's happening in a moment to moment basis, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the improvisation isn't experienced as a good improvisation. And I think also because music and improvisation is by definition ambiguous. I think this is an important point as well, because the history of particularly Western musicology at times has emphasized that if you have a particular higher level of understanding, then you can listen to a piece of music and extract from the music what the composer or the performer meant. My argument is that music is by definition ambiguous, and it doesn't matter what meaning a performer or a composer wants to put on a piece of music. When we listen to it, we listen to any piece of music via our own personal, our own family, and our own cultural experiences, and we give that music a particular meaning. And that meaning is neither right nor wrong. And so therefore, when we're improvising, it stands to reason that two improvising musicians will not necessarily define the same piece of improvised music in the same way. Of course they can. It's possible, but it's not essential. And myself and Graeme showed that when we asked different musicians to listen to an improvisation by the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, the musicians defined these moments in different ways. Even silences were defined, and the paper was called The Sign of Silence, where some musicians were defining the silence as that was a very dramatic moment, and I really enjoyed the sensitivity that I could hear in a particular musician's playing. And another musician said, I was fed up with the music at that point. I decided not to play because what I wanted was less music from everybody. And so but there's no right answer in terms of what the music is. So I guess the key point here is music is ambiguous, improvisation is ambiguous, and we don't need to define a particular improvisatory moment in the same way in order for it to be seen as good or successful or meaningful. But yeah, I mean, of course, it happens. And I guess with very experienced improvisers, it may be that there are key moments you can say, so even today, when we were playing upstairs, I could hear the end coming in a piece, and everybody in the group seemed to agree this is the end coming, and we stopped. So there was an agreement in the group about these types of musical gestures are signalling that the end is coming, and we all stopped. So in that sense, there was a moment where it was unambiguously coming to an end, and that doesn't always happen with large groups.
Yeah, you can have a kind of macro view on the whole process of improvisation, but you can then also look into this micro things happening. So there can be misunderstandings, but they can be very productive at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. And also sometimes celebrating those misunderstandings is really, it can be really joyous as well. Particularly in endings too, where somebody thinks, well, this is very clearly coming to an end, but somebody else might say, well, actually, this is my moment to shine because I want to play a particular phrase or play something, and then afterwards we can say, oh, actually, that was a lovely moment where 5 people in the band stopped, but 2 people in the band kept playing and extended that improvisation for another 3 or 4 minutes.
Since we've now been talking also about the result in a way, and you have before also said that it's very much about the process, and what you would say is the relation between the process and the product? I mean, usually there's a lot of emphasis on the process in improvised music or improvisation processes. But in the end, there's also a product. There's what the audience experiences, for example.
And of course, I mean, if we're going to present something that we celebrate as being process-based in a public context, then it's very important to acknowledge that is also, if you like, a product. And so I guess that there's two aspects to this. So I think one is inviting an audience in to watch an improvisation can still be celebrating the process. So, for example, if we had an audience watching the workshop upstairs today, they would be experiencing the process. And I think there is something really exciting and engaging and rewarding about watching an improvisation unfold, where you say, we're not sure what we're doing here or where it's going, but we're improvising. There's a drama of watching, whether it's 2 people or 12 people, negotiate, say, okay, who's going to play next, and the eye contact, and we talked about the eye contact, the non-verbal communication. When you're in the room watching and listening to improvised music, there is a real narrative and a real drama to the way in which the process unfolds, which I think is rewarding and enjoyable itself. So I think, in a sense, the process becomes the output. Now, we can argue to say, well, I want to hear certain types of sounds, or I want to hear certain types of melodies, or I don't, I'm drawn to electronic improvising, or I'm drawn to a particular aesthetic. But my argument at a general level would be that the process becomes the output, and that process is, by its very nature, interesting and engaging. There's a different argument that says, well, once you record it, and you put it on a CD, or you put it in a film and put it up on YouTube, then it's a different type of a product. And there, the argument maybe becomes a little bit more different, to say, well, how can something that celebrates the moment, celebrates the process, and celebrates the moment to such a great extent, that invites people in and say, you when you're in the moment and you can see the decisions being made, that's really exciting. That's you're getting to look at an improvised story unfold in real time, and that process is really interesting. And here's the CD, where maybe 50% is missing, 60%, we can put a figure on it. Is that CD just as interesting and just as important? That, I mean, and once again, you're speaking to somebody that releases CDs all the time, so even although I struggle. Well, my argument there is that then you have to listen back and say, is there something to be gained that listening to the output here? So not only was the process of generating it interesting, but listening back to it is a rewarding experience as well. It's not the same, and maybe there are elements that are missing, but maybe there's something to be gained as well. You say, well, I'm not in the room watching the musicians negotiate, but I know I'm sitting in my house, or I'm listening on a train, and I'm experiencing it in a completely different way from the way the audience experienced it. And there's still something to be it's a different aesthetic experience. And although the process-based elements are maybe not there, these are interesting sounds to listen to. There's the overarching concept is still very, very strong. I really like the way that Evan Parker's saxophone sounds. I really like the way Maggie Nichols' voice sounds. I really like hearing the interaction between the musicians once it's been recorded, and of course the relationship between, because of course some of these CDs are partly composed as well. So then when you listen to the outputs, you start to hear, oh, there's the structural elements that I really enjoy, or there's a particular melody that repeats, that combines with the improvised improvised elements. So I think, yes, they're two very different things, and yeah, I'm very aware that lots of people talk about recording an improvised concert and releasing as a CD. Means that you're going to lose certain elements, but I also think you retain certain elements and you gain other elements as well when you choose to listen back to it.
Well, I think your work and the book is really a celebration of improvisation. Since you just said improvisation as a celebration of the moment, and you are celebrating improvisation as well. It's omnipresent in the book, I would say, or in your research. And on Thursday, when you played with the Berlin Improvisers Orchestra, you were also talking of a golden age of improvisation. Yes. Is there anything which is very exciting for you at the moment in critical improvisation studies? Where do we go? Maybe as a last question.
Yeah. I do believe that we are in a golden moment for improvisation. I do believe that improvisation is a process whose time has come. I think we see that in festivals all over the world, where improvisation is now a key part of the programming of that festival. We see that in courses all over the world as well, which might not be called improvisation, but have improvisation as a fundamental part of their teaching. I see that in even large improvising ensembles. They now exist in so many countries around the world. And so people are increasingly coming to emphasize the importance of improvisation and the role that improvisation can play in fostering collaboration and developing new ways of working artistically, and in developing new ways of understanding what it means to be human in a very complex complex time in our history. I think also, as the boundaries between disciplines become blurred, and I think that's another important point, critical improvisation studies is allowing us to forge these links between writing and music, between art and dance, between animation and sound art. I would see improvisation as, and once again, I'm coming to the end of my time in Berlin, so I'm going to be grandiose, as the most important process that helps us fuse the different disciplines together. And indeed, even within music making, there's much talk about music making now being in a time of post-genre music making. The clearly defined genre boundaries, they are breaking down, and contemporary music making is now seen as just that, contemporary. It's not contemporary classical or contemporary jazz or contemporary pop music. Contemporary music now blurs the central codified elements of different genres into the one. And improvisation has a really important part to play in that as well, in that it is propelling us forward into new periods of creative work into new periods of composition. It's blurring, and once again, it's blurring the boundaries between composition and improvisation. What is composition? What is improvisation? You know, we're now quite comfortable in saying we're not so sure. It's not so clear, and I think these elements are going to be front and centre in critical improvisation discourse studies, and also in the type of art and the type of collaborative projects that are made. I think increasingly, and this is another really important part, increasingly the social implications of what we're doing, improvisation and art and music, that has at its heart social justice, and it brings to bear, shines a light on social issues, I think is going to be increasingly important as well. No longer is it enough to be virtuosic in the old sense of the word, and what we might want to say, improvisation is helping challenge notions of patriarchy, notions of decolonization within the music and within wider arts. Wow, I'm tumbling everything out into this last to this last question here, but I really believe that. I think it's a really exciting time to be involved in working with improvisation, because it draws together all these different strands and helps us understand what it means to be a creative musician, a creative artist in very complex and challenging times. Improvisation has a fundamental role to help us engage critically with how to be creative in very complex times.
Raymond, thank you very much. It was really very nice to talk to you. Very, very enlightening to have you here. Thanks for accepting the invitation to come to Exploratorium for 3 different events.
It's a real, yeah, I was going to say, my head, I mean, I've had an incredible time. I want to thank you very much, to say it's been fabulous, you know, to perform, to run workshops, and to have this lecture. I mean, I've really enjoyed it. My head's spinning slightly. I hope it's been okay. This is quite unusual to sort of. I hope I've been articulate and clear, and that people have got something out of what I've had to say. But I want to thank you and thank everybody involved in this wonderful place. It's been, and I've had an incredible week. It's really
That's
really
great to
wonderful.
hear. So thank you, Raymond MacDonald.
Thank you.